The Phaedrus is the great lyrical masterpiece in the Platonic corpus. It is arguably the most beautiful thing Plato ever produced, and while it usually isn't ranked in the first tier of the Platonic dialogues because it doesn't cover the great variety of issues that we see in something like the Republic, or perhaps also in the Symposium or in the Phaedo, the Phaedrus is still one of the most beautiful things ever written. The primary themes are love and rhetoric, and it instantiates the rhetorical ideas and the rhetorical suggestions that are made in the end of the dialogue. The early speeches, 3 speeches on love, are progressively more philosophical and progressively more beautiful, and they provide us with some things to think about that never really go out of style, in the sense that perhaps the theory of forms is no longer explicitly adopted by most working philosophers. Nearly everyone is still a working lover. Love hasn't really disappeared, and it hasn't altered it nearly so much as epistemology or ontology. And for that reason, the Phaedrus still speaks to us in a direct and immediate way, in a sense that perhaps some of the other more logical, more technical dialogues do not. Poetry ages better than logic, perhaps. Well, what goes on, or the setting of this dialogue, and it's only between 2 people, between Socrates and Phaedrus, a gifted or potentially superior young man, who is a budding rhetorician, and he also wants to know about the nature of love. Phaedrus is going to be mentioned in the Symposium later on, when we have the speeches in favor of love, or speeches in praise of love that are given there. Phaedrus will be represented once again, but here he serves as a foil to Socrates, as a man who doesn't understand love, but like all of us has a need to understand it because love tells us something about ourselves. Among the themes that we're going to see in this dialogue is the construction of identity, the construction of personality or the self in the loving interaction, the struggle towards knowledge, towards truth, towards completeness that is characteristic of the Socratic dialogues. Now, Phaedrus is an attractive young man, and in the homosexual aristocratic milieu of Athens, he's very much sought after, and in particular, one orator named Lysias is attracted to him, but can't figure out how to seduce him. So he writes a speech of seduction. And Phaedrus is very impressed with this speech, and perhaps by implication impressed with Lysias, and he's decided to walk outside the city, outside the walls of the city, and practice the speech so that he can learn it, both its content and the proper mode of delivery. Now, symbolism is very important here. When we walk outside the walls of the city, we are moving from the realm of nomos, which is to say convention, political law, justice in the sophistic sense, towards nature. In other words, the sophists have established a sort of dichotomy between nomos and phusis, between conventional political law and the laws of nature and the facts of life. And by moving from the internal part of the city, we're moving symbolically from nomos to phusis, if you're willing to accept such a distinction. Phaedrus probably does. Certainly Lysias, the orator who wrote this, does. Now, on the way out of the city, Socrates sees Phaedrus, and Phaedrus is a little embarrassed, a little ashamed. He hides this speech under his cloak. Socrates, who is very hard to fool, knows that Phaedrus is hiding something. He says, well, let's continue on the journey. Let's move outside the city from the realm of the urban area to a lovely pastoral surrounding with a river and some trees and some grass, and let's go back to nature. So the symbolism here is that we're going to examine love as it naturally is, and we'll find out that the nature of love is not diminished by moving outside the realm of political or moral conventions. In other words, Socrates is going to try and undo the distinctions created by the sophists between nomos and phusis. What Socrates is going to do is show us that there's one overarching principle, the orderly and well-disciplined soul, which is true to the ideal of love, both within the city and without. So there's no distinction between the internal desires and the external man. There's no hypocrisy. There's no disjunction between the internal state of the soul and the external state of behavior. They're going to try and unify that. Whereas Phaedrus hasn't reached that point yet. He's ashamed and wants to hide the speech of seduction that he's brought with him. And Socrates says, come on, I want to hear your speech. You can't hide it from me. Come and you can repeat it to me. So they settle down by a river, and the river has mythological implications. It's by this river that Boreas, the north wind, swept away his wife who was a nymph, and apparently there's a combination of marriage and rape involved here, but in particular it's connected with the idea of rhetoric as being somehow forcible, rhetoric as somehow being violent, and the alternative to that will be the true rhetoric that Socrates shows us, which is a combination of dialectic and right rhetorical principles, which allow us to speak the truth simultaneously to speak persuasively. So Socrates is going to teach us about rhetoric and about love in the same discourse, and he's going to teach it to us under a unique circumstance, outside the walls of the city, which he doesn't do in any other dialogue. Socrates is a creature of the city. Whenever he moves outside its walls, something important is happening. Now let's look at the first speech. Socrates sits down and he has Phaedrus explain this speech to him. And the speech is something like this. The lover is a madman. The lover is insane. And the madness of love is a kind of detrimental insanity, which makes a man harm himself and harm his beloved. Whether it's male or female isn't especially relevant here. In other words, the idea is finding some other person that you desire in the physical sense is the argument that Lysias is making. And you're better off having sex with someone that does not love you because they lack that madness. In other words, this is a deeply corrupt and deeply cynical speech. And Lysias obviously really is attracted to Phaedrus, but wants to convince him in a kind of cynical, shallow way that he doesn't love him and that's why he ought to have sex with him. So the idea here is that love is a kind of desire, and love is a corrupting kind of desire. It takes a corrupt soul and makes it more corrupt, and also makes the beloved corrupt, because naturally someone who wishes to possess, to take control of, to take charge of someone else means it for his own benefit, not for the benefit of the beloved. In other words, it's a purely selfish love. And Lysias cannot imagine any love that wasn't completely selfish and that wasn't completely physical. And this is an extremely corrupt love, the kind of love that you would expect of a purely bronze soul. If you remember what the distinction between the gold, silver, and bronze in the Republic, a purely appetitive, consuming soul that has no element of honor, that has no element of spiritual superiority, that has no real love for anything but themselves. So there's a number of corrupt elements, morally dubious, morally evil elements in this first speech. And in addition to this content, this immoral content, the form of the speech is terrible. It's one of the worst speeches ever written. It's the best parody of a poor speech that you could imagine. What Lysias says in the speech is an arbitrary series of paragraphs that don't make any sense in any particular order. He doesn't define his terms. He doesn't try and organize it into a logical progression from one thought to another. All of the paragraphs in this speech, or most of the paragraphs, start with the proposition, and observe this, X, Y, Z, and observe this, A, B, C, and observe this, D, E, F. The point being that you could change the order in any way, and you could still observe all these things. Also emphasize the fact that think about what Plato thinks about knowledge. If you think about the divided line and the myth of the cave, the last thing Plato wants to do is to observe anything. How are you going to learn by observation? That just tells you about the realm of the senses, which is appropriate if you have a completely base soul, if you don't know what real love is, if you don't know what soul love is, if your entire orientation in your emotional life is towards sexual gratification, towards skin sex, towards bodies, well then observing things would be about the best you're ever going to do. It is a purely earthly love, but in the most pejorative possible sense. So Phaedrus gives this speech, reads it off the scroll, and Socrates makes a number of ironic comments about it. Phaedrus really admires it. He admires it so much that he's been going outside the city walls so that he can memorize it, because he thinks this is a great tribute both to love and to himself, and he thinks that this is real wisdom about love. And Socrates thinks, thank God I met you and was able to get to you before you memorized this sort of thing. It's a deeply corrupt sort of thing. I guess it's something analogous to what you might expect from something like Hugh Hefner. Right? So, well, no, I mean, it's the same idea, though. I mean, sex is something that you do to satisfy immediate bodily desires, and when you gratify yourself, you just move on. It's nothing to get excited about. Take a shower and forget it. It's not a big deal, right? It has no emotional resonance. It has nothing to do with souls. It is meat coming together. And for that reason, it is deeply dangerous to the education of youth. It is the opposite of love. It is the inverse of love. As Socrates will show us a little later on, love is primarily concerned with the benefit of the beloved. Love is primarily concerned with the construction of your own identity in the process of constructing the identity of the other. Real love in the Platonic sense, first of all, is highly sexual. It doesn't have much to do with bodies, but it's highly emotive and desiring. It's not a pale ghost of love. Actually, it has tremendous emotional resources and emotional resonance. But here we have the foil of that first, the poor speech. And Socrates says, well, after thinking about it, the only difficulties that I see is that it's false in content and it's incoherent in form. But apart from that, it's a wonderful speech. And of course, Phaedrus says, are you making a joke here? And what's really important about this is that this goes back to the Gorgias, right? And to other dialogues in which people have said, Socrates, are you joking with us? Are you laughing at us? And of course Socrates is joking with you. Of course he's laughing at you. But the fact that he's joking doesn't mean that he isn't serious. This false dichotomy between being serious and being humorous collapses when we deal with Socrates. Of course it's a joke. What could be funnier than a stupid speech about love in which people really don't love each other and in which one person makes the other worse? That's not real love. That's the opposite of that. Everybody else is being much more ironic than he is. They just don't realize it. So Socrates says, I can give you a better speech than that. Right off the top of my head, it's really not a problem. The problem with this speech, with Lysias' speech, is that he treats love as the unreasoning desire for the beautiful, and you want as much of the beautiful as you can, and you want to absorb it as much as you can because it's all about gratification. Socrates says, I'll give you a better speech than that, no problem. What he does, before he gives this his first speech, which is the middle speech in the three that are offered in this dialogue, he puts a cloak over his head. I'll explain the symbolism of this in a little while, but he says, before I give this speech, this improved Lysias speech, I'm going to put a cloak over my head, and he does, and then he gives a speech, and it improves on Lysias. It's not the best speech, but it's a wonderfully moving speech. It's certainly a lot better than the speech of Lysias. And if you hadn't seen Socrates' final speech in this dialogue, you would think it was a terrific speech, that you could compare with any of the great speeches on love, any of the great speeches in Romeo and Juliet would be in the same league. It's just gorgeous. Well, what Socrates does is he says, look, I can improve this speech for the following way. First thing I'm going to do is define my term. I'm going to explain to you what love is. That's a great improvement over Lysias. And then even if I don't have completely true knowledge about love, I can at least move towards an honorable, true opinion about love. And in addition to that, he's going to organize it in a logical progression, which is so important to any kind of Platonic conception of beauty. Beauty both in the beloved, that's one of the reasons why one falls in love, because you see an image of beauty in someone else, but also there's a beauty and a grace and a harmony in this speech itself. It actually moves from a beginning to a middle to an end. It makes sense. And that is attractive to Plato as an intellectual sort of beauty, in the same way that a well-formed horse, right, with a natural proportion between the parts might be a very attractive figure of the horse compared to one with very disproportionate parts. Well, this second speech then is an improved version of Lysias' speech, and what he says is, look, if love is an unreasoning desire for the beautiful, and it's just desire, it's just an emotional impulse, then it's always a bad idea. You should never fall in love if that's what love is. And although Socrates is able to explain love a little better than Lysias ever had, he really doesn't do it justice because he treats Lysias' assumptions, at least in part, as being true. That love is a kind of mere desire, and that it is an essentially unreasoning desire, and that it is, if not completely selfish, it is at least, it straddles the line between interest in the self and interest in the other. Well, Socrates breaks off in the middle of this speech, and he says, I've just praised the non-lover, or I've just praised the lover, and I've said the best I could about him, but the difficulty is that I don't want to go any further with this. I don't like this, the fact that you've brought me into this dialectic, that you've got me involved in talking about this. Socrates had made a few earlier references to Stesichorus and Ibycus. These are both lyric poets. Now, Plato, whenever he makes references to Greek literature, it's always important in the dialogue. And here we are in a pastoral setting talking about love. Stesichorus and Ibycus are two of the greatest lyric poets in Greek history. And this is literally Plato's attempt at creating a new and improved lyric. We're in nature, we've moved out of the city, and what's more appropriate to lyric poetry, and we're talking about powerful emotional experiences, which is the stuff of lyric poetry. And Socrates, during the speech, says, I'm becoming dithyrambic. Dithyram is the typical metrical foot of lyric poetry. So Socrates is saying, I'm getting all excited, I'm losing control, I'm not creating the thoroughly logical, organized speech that I usually like to and that I would do if I could, and I don't want to go on with this because I think I've gone down the wrong path. So Socrates says, look, I have to go. Now, at this point, Phaedrus stops him. Phaedrus says, no, stay here. It's scorching noonday, right? Because they started at the beginning of the day, went on. It is now scorching noonday. Please, don't go. Finish your speech. And I would like to know more about the non-lover. Praise the non-lover, just like Lysias did. You know, you've made an improvement here, and your speech seems to be better. Take it the whole way. And Socrates says, no, I can't do that. I've done something wrong. Scorching noonday. Remember when the sun comes up and it's very hot? The rising of the good, or we're going to move from evil towards some kind of apogee, and then we're going to move towards a further elaboration of the good. Also in this case, heat is connected with the idea of passion, with the idea of emotion. This is the high point of passion, and now as the afternoon waxes and as the sun begins to set, we're going to have a setting of passion, and the decline of passion will be the rise of reason, and the rise of reason will be the articulation of noble love, of real love, of love in the Socratic sense. Socrates says, I've just heard from my daimon. Remember that he has a daimon in his head that tells him only what he ought not to do. Never gives him any other information, just tells him what he ought not to do. And the daimon says, stay where you are, Socrates. You must stay where you are because you have done something impious. You have done something wrong. You have done something evil. Socrates, you must make amends because the gods have been listening. The gods will not tolerate this sort of slander of love. You sound like a man that knows no holy, honest, faithful, true love. And Socrates says, you're right. Remember what happened to Stesichorus? I suppose that I am going to have to make amends and give a second speech that will articulate the true nature of love. Now, since almost all of you don't know who Stesichorus is and what Stesichorus is, let me clue you in, because once you think about that element here, the whole dialogue begins to make a little more sense. Stesichorus is one of the great lyric poets of Greek literature. And he's well known for having made two speeches about Helen of Troy. The first speech, he was very, not a speech, but a poem about Helen of Troy. And in the first poem, he said some very unkind, very cruel things, gave her a very harsh evaluation. And as a result, the gods were wrathful, the gods were angry, and Stesichorus was blinded. Remember that Homer was blinded, or was blind all his life, but Stesichorus was made blind, and then and the reason why he had made this very impious, very critical speech of Helen is because he had read about Helen of Troy from Homer. So Homer is the real target here, right? Homer's been miseducating everyone, including the lyric poets. So as a consequence, the lyric poets don't understand about love. The exemplification of that is Helen of Troy here. And because of that, the gods are angry and the gods deprive him of sight. Sight always being an image of moral knowledge. Think about the cave, right? Let's unify some of these symbols. Well, Stesichorus immediately understands what his transgression has been, and he understands how to purify himself, because purification is one of the big themes in this discourse. I'll discuss that in a second, but Stesichorus purifies himself by writing a new poem, an encomium on Helen. Not that she's entirely blameless, but that she doesn't deserve the same degree of criticism that she had gotten in his first poem. As a result, the gods give Stesichorus back his sight. Now, let's remember the fact that in this first speech, Socrates has a cloak over his head. He has voluntarily deprived himself of sight. Well, in this last speech that he is going to give, his improved speech on love, Socrates won't be wearing a cloak on his head because it will be analogous to the second speech of Stesichorus, the second speech which tells the truth about love. So he has given back his moral sight. He is no longer plagued by moral blindness, and the problem of impiety is resolved. So what Socrates is going to do is give a second speech which will be the true encomium on love. And that means that he has to start again from the beginning and chuck out just about everything that was in Lysias' speech, because it really can't be salvaged and yet turned into a good speech. A good speech will have to start from scratch. And as Socrates says in a very important line in the dialogue, the essence of good speech is telling the truth. There can be no good speech without good content. You have to know what you're talking about before you can make a good speech. And Lysias didn't, and even trying to improve on Lysias leaves you stuck with certain of Lysias's sentiments, certain of Lysias's forms, and the only way to really construct a good speech on love is to go back to square one, start from scratch. So that's why he doesn't come through with that speech. It was impious and it was monstrous, and he feels bad about it. And he starts out by saying, yes, it's true, love is a kind of madness. Love is a kind of insanity. But do not make the impious mistake of thinking that all insanity is evil. Actually, some insanity is divine. It's sent by the gods. And there are at least three or four, actually four kinds of insanity that are clearly divine, that are sent from the gods, that are sent as a benefit to human beings, not as a punishment. And the different kinds of madness that are divine and sent by the gods, first of all, prophecy. Whenever someone is divinely inspired and is speaking for the god, they don't understand what they're saying. They don't sit down and do some rational calculation. The gods are inspiring them. They're able to speak for the gods. The second kind will be purgation. When we find some way of atoning for our sins, when sins have been handed down, blood guilt and things like that, the way in which we are absolved of our sins involves some sort of divine madness, some sort of rite or ritual which allows you to get rid of your sin. He says specifically that lyric poetry, the poetry which expresses powerful individual emotions, is always a kind of madness. The lyric poets don't understand what they're talking about, but if they're good at what they do, they are good because they're inspired. So this kind of inspiration is a divine madness, and the fourth kind of divine madness is love. And in that respect, all of us are insane at some point in our life. With any luck, we will be insane all through our lives. But this kind of madness is a blessing. This kind of madness improves and perfects the soul, and it helps you improve and perfect those whom you love. This is not a punishment. This is the greatest gift the gods can bestow upon us. Now, what's very interesting about this third speech is that I said that divine madness was purgation of sin, prophecy, and the kind of influx of the divine. I said it was lyric poetry, and I said it was love itself. Socrates' third speech is all these things. It is divinely inspired, it is lyric poetry, it is about love. He loves Phaedrus and also loves all his fellow men. Socrates is the great instantiation of love in a kind of divine, superhuman sense. Now, another way of thinking about the progression in these speeches is that we could say Lysias's first speech is the bronze speech, right? It refers to the bronze part of the soul. That the second speech, or the first one produced by Socrates, but Socrates' middle speech, is the silver speech. It's certainly better than the bronze speech. It has true opinion, if not knowledge. It has some sort of sense of honor and sense of superior emotion, but it doesn't ever really complete the progress of the soul towards knowledge of love. The final speech that he gives, the encomium on love, one of the greatest speeches in the Western tradition. I don't think it's been improved on as love poetry ever. It's just gorgeous. And it's not about bodies, it's about souls. It's about aspiration towards what's best. Anybody, if any of the audience has ever been in love, you know that it's some kind of wrinkle in the fabric of reality. It's not like the tables and chairs that you encounter normally. It does something to you and makes you want to give a blessing, a benediction on the world. It makes you want to improve and perfect the beloved, because the beloved is somehow an image of that which is perfect, of that which is worth aspiring to. It somehow justifies your suffering. It somehow makes you feel that all the misery or all the incoherence and all the nonsense in life somehow makes sense. And by improving and perfecting the beloved and doing what you can to make them more divine and godlike, you gratify yourself that much more, and also at the same time you improve your own self that much more and make yourself that much more lovable. So there is a fine reciprocity of identity creation in the Socratic conception of love that he gives in this third speech. So he gives us this idea of divine madness and says, love is a kind of madness from the gods. And he says, I must give you an image of the soul, because Socrates' kind of love is soul love. It's bodily love in the most attenuated sense, in the sense that people have to take up space and all, but it's not primarily concerned with that. And he says, the soul is like a chariot with winged horses. You know Pegasus, the horse with wings? Well, imagine a chariot driven by a charioteer with two horses in front, one black, one white. Now the gods, fortunately for them, are pure soul. They don't have bodies at all. And they have just two white horses that are easy to control because the white horse is the good horse. It's the horse on the right-hand side. And that takes them up to the top of the universe where they're able to contemplate pure being. They engage in the banquet of the gods where they have contemplation of truth in the form of good, in the form of the beautiful, in the form of the virtuous. In other words, the soul is a kind of winged thing. It takes us up out of the realm of space and time altogether. This image of the chariot of the soul is what carries us out of space and time into the realm of the forms. Up we go, up the divided line, out of the cave altogether, and we go flying out. And love helps the chariot of the soul take flight. Now, for regular human beings as opposed to gods, we don't have two white horses. We have a white one and a black one. The white one is docile, well-behaved. It's our silver soul. It's the part of our emotions which are orderly, restrained, just, and docile. On the other hand, we have certain impulses, physical passions, the desire for possession. All the bronze elements in the soul are represented by the black horse. And the black horse is very hard to restrain. In other words, getting the chariot of the soul to move properly and harmoniously is a question of getting your good emotions hooked up with your bad emotions, or at least your forcible, dominating emotions, connected to your other emotions, so that the chariot of the soul can move up to the realm of the gods. Those of us who manage to control ourselves and create self-discipline, who create moderation, because the chariot, of course, represents the gold part of the soul, the rational part. Well, the gold part is supposed to drive these horses, and it's easy to drive the white horse, but the black horse is a problem. Now, those of us who manage to create moderation and order within the soul can move up to the realm of the gods and move to what Plato calls to stand on the back of the universe and to see all of reality. It's a lovely image of moving outside of space and time altogether into the soul world. And what happens when we go up there is that if we do that, we are preserved and can live among the gods and contemplate the true forms of good and being and truth for 10,000 years, because the whole cosmos moves in a 10,000-year cycle. On the other hand, if we don't manage to restrain ourselves, if we don't create self-discipline and moderation and harmony within, the result is that the horses damage their wings. And these damaged wings fall to earth because they can no longer support themselves, and they are embodied as human beings. In other words, the condition of humanity, the human condition, is a state of radical deprivation. We are souls that have somehow been stuck in this tables and chairs world, and this is not where we really belong. And all of our longings for perfection, for beauty, for truth, is a distant and fuzzy and inconclusive recollection of what we saw when we were pure souls. In other words, the earth, the world of substance, gets in the way of our recollection. Remember what recollection means from the Meno? It's real knowledge of the ultimate forms. Well, down here, we remember once in a while what we could have been, what we once were. And as a consequence of that, love enters into our life. Whenever we fall in love, what we see in the beloved is not meat moving around. What we see is a memory of some image of some perfect beauty. It's an embodiment of something we saw in an earlier life, at an earlier phase in our spiritual development, before we too became meat. And Socrates, of course, believing in reincarnation and things like that, holds the view that if people pursue an excellent love, the kind of love which tries to improve the beloved and make them even more like that image of perfect beauty or perfect virtue or perfect truth, then we perfect ourselves and we improve the other. And this is what love really is. It's none of this stuff that Lysias was telling us about gratifying our desires in a rational way. It's not like that at all. What real love is, in Socrates' sense, is an attempt to perfect the other through improving their soul, which is what, incidentally, Socrates is doing with Phaedrus here. That's his idea of love. This instantiates all the things that he is talking about. And if after being born 3 times, because there's a 3-time circle, there's a circle of reincarnation in life, and at the end of one's life, you're judged and punished or rewarded for 1,000 years, and then you come back. So you have 10 cycles of birth and death in the cosmic cycle, because it goes around once every 10,000 years. If you have been virtuous in your pursuit of love in those 10,000 years, you may get your wings back and essentially join the angels again, which is where you belong. On the other hand, if you do not, you can fall down the scale of being. And if you pursue a philosophical love, like Socrates does, that is not interested in bodies but is interested in souls, that is not interested in gratification but is interested in truth and wisdom and justice and virtue, well then you only need to go around 3 times and then you will be absorbed back to the gods directly. The idea is that we are all somehow angels, right, that happen to be in this physical world due to some mistake that happened when we were back in heaven. Isn't it, I think it's Ralph Waldo Emerson that says that the earth is an insane asylum for crazy angels, and that occasionally they lapse back into their former sanity and see what they could have been and what they once were. I think that's the idea here. In other words, that the human condition is a radically deprived condition, and that occasionally we see glimpses of what we once were and what we in the future could be. And that love somehow is the bridge between heaven and earth. This is the most beautiful lyric poetry that anybody can possibly imagine. And I mean, my speech could not possibly do justice to this third speech. Of all the dialogues that I've taught in this lecture series, this is the one you should read first because it's the most beautiful and it's the most moving, and this never goes out of style. This never gets stale. This is true forever. And for that reason, run, don't walk, get yourself a copy of this and read this. I mean, I can't do justice to it, but take my word for it, you will be better off for having encountered this. Well, what happens is that we find out that sex is to the body what good, improving speech is to the soul. And Socrates is primarily concerned with soul sex. In other words, he's interested in speech, sort of speech that improves the other by improving their soul, and by improving them, you make yourself more attractive, more beneficial, more beneficent to them. And this is the unselfish love. This is a sort of divine love. This is a love supreme. And Socrates says that a true speech about love must gesture at that because that is the true love. And as he says earlier, the essence of a good speech is knowing what you're talking about. The essence of a good speech is telling the truth. And that is why Socrates can give this third speech with his head uncovered, because like Stesichorus, he is now telling the truth, and like Stesichorus, he has been moved from a condition of moral blindness to moral knowledge. All right? So there's tremendously complicated levels of symbolism going on here. In some ways, philosophical love is a response to the Delphic injunction. Remember the Oracle of Delphi says, know thyself? Well, you can't know yourself in isolation. You can only know yourself through someone else. That's what love does for you. Because in speech, I mean, there's a couple of references to it in the dialogue itself. Socrates and Phaedrus are in speech holding mirrors up to each other, saying, don't I know my Socrates? Don't I know my Phaedrus? I know what you're really thinking. Your personality, your soul is constructed in speech, and it becomes evident to your lover and also to you in the process of pursuing this true love, this love that is interested in the good of the other. And by pursuing the good of the other, you actually, in the long run, and even in the short run, pursue your own good. This is the man that truly understands what's beneficial to himself and to those he loves. And Socrates has a kind of universal love. In this case, it's directed towards Phaedrus, but actually he does this for everyone. He allows anyone to construct their identity, and he tries to improve all that he encounters. This is the true universal love. So I think it's a mistake to describe Platonic love as being asexual, as being unemotional. That's not true at all. It's just that it's not primarily concerned with the meat in life. It's primarily concerned with soul. It's soul sex. Now, after giving this beautiful praise of love, this beautiful, pious, religious, sacred love, Socrates says, now that I'm on the topic, and now that I've explained to you what love is and how love works, I want to make a few observations about rhetoric, because it seems to me, son, that if you liked Lysias' speech, there's something wrong with your appreciation of how speaking works, what speaking is for, and what makes a speech good. And here what we're doing is moving from instances, from examples of speeches, right, that get progressively better. They go from bronze to silver to gold. And also these three speeches correspond to the dark horse, the light horse, and the charioteer, the purely reasonable person that has complete control, a divine, godlike control over his emotions. Well, he says, let's move from the examples of speech to the essence of speech. What makes a speech good? And the first thing is that, like Lysias in that first speech, who is trying to seduce you, the sophists, because Lysias is a professional rhetorician, he's an orator, are the seducers of the demos. In other words, in the same way that you might construct a corrupt speech with the intention of seducing some individual, the sophists are constructing corrupt political speeches because the city is like the man with the intention of of seducing the demos, of taking control of Athens, but only for their own gratification. Socrates, being the image of the true lover and also the true politician, wants to persuade people, if he can, for their own benefit. His speeches tell the truth with the intention of improving both the individual and the society as a whole. Now, to speak well, you have to know a couple of things. Knowledge is the essence of good speech. First of all, you have to know what you're talking about. Second of all, you have to know who you're talking to. You have to tailor your speech to the person that you are trying to persuade or the person you're trying to inform. And if possible, your speech should verge on or move towards dialectic. And here's the idea. Socrates doesn't want to abandon dialectic for rhetoric. Rhetoric may be necessary sometimes, as was the case in persuading Phaedrus that he had the true conception of love. But the same tendency in dialectic towards breaking things apart and putting them back together will be found in the rhetorical exercises of Socrates. In other words, he tries to make his rhetoric verge upon dialectic. And this love of divisions and putting things together, splitting things up into their natural parts and putting these natural parts together in a kind of harmony, in a kind of orderly procession, is what Socrates' conception of rhetoric always involves. And it's worth noting, I mean, when you read this, because it's a wonderful piece, how many dialectical opposites he is connecting here and bringing together. I have the margins to my book are covered with them, but let me give you some of the balance, the parts of the balancing act he's doing. The seducer is to the true lover, as the physical lover is to the mental lover, as the demagogue is to the gold politician, as the sophist is to the philosopher, as the human is to the divine, as the temporal is to the eternal, as rhetoric is to dialectic, as writing is to speech, as the first love of Lysias is to the last love of Socrates, as a donkey is to a horse, as the first speech is to the third speech, as the dark horse is to the white horse. You see how we have this set of dichotomies and this, he split the world up perfectly? As probability is to certainty, as appearance is to reality, as opinion is to knowledge, as belief is to truth, as passion is to reason, as body is to soul. You're getting the idea? He's creating a sort of logical fugue. When I was reading this, it was back in California. I happened to be listening to Bach at the time. I was listening to one of the Brandenburgs, and I think the third Brandenburg was closing. And all of the gears and all of the wheels started to close in on each other, and you realize they mesh just perfectly. Well, this is something like that, a kind of verbal counterpoint. It is a perfectly organized cosmos where everything is juxtaposed against its opposite to create a completely harmonious connection of opposites. And isn't this what the organization and the ideal state of the soul really is? In other words, the self is mirrored in speech. We exist in the realm of the logos. We are souls, not bodies. And for that reason, we will find our identity, we will find ourselves in the kind of speech we make, and you will have a reflection of the soul of the speaker in someone else's speech. It is clear from Lysias' speech that he has a very disorderly soul, that the state of his chaotic soul is just like the state of his chaotic speech. That there's a one-to-one isomorphism, and exactly the opposite is true for Socrates. Socrates can juggle 15 or 20 or 30 different antinomies, between body and soul, truth and falsehood, reason and passion, all these things at the same time, and then bring them together like the conductor of an orchestra. When he steps up to the podium, they all start playing as well as they possibly can, and they all come in exactly when they're supposed to. And you can't imagine a more literally musical speech. Socrates says in the Republic that we must be trained in both gymnastics and the muses. Well, the muses are here. The muse of poetry has taken control of him. Remember that he said that lyric poetry was a kind of divine madness? No one constructs something like this sitting down and logically cogitating. You need reason, of course, but you need more than that. You need divine inspiration. You need divine madness. And look at how Socrates has clearly instantiated this divine madness. He said that prophecy, and he talks about the connection between mantic and manic. Manic in Greek means insane. Mantic means prophetic. It's only a change of one letter. And this is always very important to the Greeks, that a prophecy or being divinely inspired is just one step away from being crazy. So Socrates says, look, I am divinely inspired. I can tell. Look, I'm breaking into these dithyrambics. So he's divinely inspired. He has that prophetic gift. In addition to that, it's a purgation. He said that those rituals and those rites which allows you to be absolved of your sins, well, this third speech is such a purgation. Remember what his first speech was like? That inferior treatment of love, which distorted his own speech, distorted his own soul, and did harm to Phaedrus by giving him wrong ideas, well, that was a sin. That was impiety. And Socrates' daimon told him, you must make amends here and now. So he is obviously divinely inspired. This is a divine sort of madness. The third element in this divine madness, lyric poetry. This is Plato's example of lyric poetry. I'll talk in a couple of lectures about why I think this is so important, but Plato produces a lyric, perhaps the greatest of the Greek lyrics, and there are very few lyrics in any phase of history which are as superior and as excellent and as beautiful as this one. So, what we have here to finish up is Socrates is in love. But then again, Socrates was always in love. Not just with Phaedrus. Socrates wishes only what is good for others. And that means that Socrates would have done this for anyone. And what did he do for Phaedrus? He brought him from a condition of ignorance to a condition of knowledge. He helped organize his soul. And Phaedrus at the end says, you know, I thought Lysias was a fine man and I thought he was a fine speaker, but I'm afraid he'll cut a very poor figure now that I have seen your soul and I have seen your speech. I am much more persuaded by you. And of course, all of nature chimes in. The cicadas have been talking all afternoon. They've been making, you know, the locusts that make those noises on summers. And Socrates makes the point that the cicadas used to be men, but they loved the music, the muses so much, and they loved singing and poetry so much that they forgot to eat. And they died. But the muses really liked the fact that they were so devoted to the muses, so they made bugs out of them that sing all the time. So, of course, we're bringing in all kinds of lyric elements, the harmony of nature and of the soul. There's no change when Socrates moves outside the city because there's no distinction between nomos and phusis. There's one universal law of love, which is the same as the law of rhetoric. Organize your soul and improve the chaos within. Now, at the end of this exercise, and this might be called a hymn to love. In other words, this is clearly sacred music. Not in the sense that you sing it, although I somehow suspect that you could sing it. Eric Satie wrote a piece called Socrates, in which he borrows certain elements out of the Phaedrus, and he creates a beautiful, transparent music, and I only wish that we could find some way to set this whole thing to music. This shouldn't be read. In some ways, this should be sung. You should have that feeling that you're singing when you're reading this. If you're not putting enough of yourself into it. Take my word for it, this is music. There's secret sounds inside this. You'll find that out when you read it well enough, or thoroughly enough, or with the right state of soul. Well, Socrates says, or Phaedrus points out, well, the sun has now set, Socrates, meaning that the heat of passion is gone, that reason has become more important, and we have now created an internal order within our souls. And Socrates says, okay, now at the last we must move from poetry to philosophy. Sun is set, and Socrates has educated his Phaedrus, and Phaedrus now has an improved soul. There's one final thing that we have to do to finish off our philosophical journey. Remember that I said also that there was a journey motif throughout all the dialogues because Socrates is the new Odysseus? Well, we moved out of the city. Now it's time to go back. Now that we've reached our goal, we've achieved our purpose. Socrates says, there's one more thing I want to teach you, one more thing that I have to do. I think we ought to say a prayer. The idea being, I think, that for Socrates, piety is the final stage of philosophical development. I know that it's not a popular idea now, but I think Socrates believed it, and I cannot imagine any other reason why this great dialogue would end on that sort of a note. I think the idea is that piety is the last stage of the growth of virtue, and the final virtue, the keystone to all the others, that holds all the others together, is a sense of obligation to the divinity. And of course, in this case, love acts as a bridge between heaven and earth. It connects us to the divinity. And the speech that he gives at the end is just gorgeous. And I mean, the prayer that he gives at the end, because it's both simple and eloquent and effective, and it shows you how to pray as well as how to talk. It's really a beautiful idea. Let me read this to you. Socrates says, "Dear Pan and all the other gods that dwell in this place, grant that I may become fair within, and that such outward things as I may have may not war against the spirit within me. May I count him rich who is wise, and as for gold, may I possess so much of it as only a temperate man might bear and carry with him. Is there anything more that we can ask for, Phaedrus? The prayer contents me." And Phaedrus says, "Make it a prayer for me too, since friends have all things in common." And then they go back to the city. So I think the argument is that love reaches into the soul, organizes the soul, and divinizes the soul. It makes you divine because you encounter some image of a divinity in another that allows you to be something other than a cogito, a limited ego that is stuck within itself. We move to our real selves. We understand our real selves only when we are in the presence of some other soul. Our souls exist with reference to, with contrast to, with connection to other souls. This is the value of love, and the connection between love and rhetoric is that it provides us a bridge from one soul to the other, and the connection between heaven and earth is justified by the fact that, is explained and articulated and made comprehensible by the fact that the gods have sent us this wonderful gift.